This plane flew so fast that enemy missiles could not reach it. So high that its titanium fuselage literally melted in flight. So extreme that it needed to leak its own fuel on the ground just so it wouldn't explode in the sky. The SR-71 Blackbird. It was not a weapon, it was an invincible ghost. It operated for 30 years, in absolute secrecy. A living legend that was never caught. In this video, we will discover the impossible engineering behind the most extraordinary flying machine ever built. If this legend has already hooked you, subscribe and give it a like. The story of how it was made is even more unbelievable. Our story begins with a disaster. May 1st, 1960, the Cold War was at its frostest point. America needed eyes. Eyes inside the impenetrable fortress of the Soviet Union. Their only tool was the U-2, a glorified glider that flew at the edge of space. The CIA called it invincible. They were wrong. On that day, a pilot named Francis Gary Powers was detected over the Urals, a ghost on the radar. The Soviets launched everything they had. SAM-2 missiles. One of them exploded close enough. The U-2, fragile and slow, disintegrated. Powers was captured. In Washington, it was panic. The humiliation was total. President Eisenhower was caught in a global lie. America no longer had eyes. They were blind. The order was given in the shadows. Not to the Air Force, not to the Navy. The order went to a place that officially did not exist. A secret complex in Burbank, California. A place called Skunk Works. Skunk Works was not a factory. It was a cult of engineering, led by an absolute genius, a tyrant of innovation, Clarence Kelly Johnson. Kelly didn't design planes. He designed the future, and he had rules. His main rule: be fast, be quiet, be right. The government gave him an impossible task. A plane that could fly at Mach 3, over 3,200 kilometers per hour, at over 80,000 feet at the edge of space. A plane that could cross the United States in 67 minutes. A plane that could photograph Moscow and be back at base before the Soviets could even have a coffee. A plane that could not be shot down by anyone, ever. But Kelly Johnson understood a fundamental problem. The enemy was not just the Soviet Union. The enemy was physics. At that speed, air friction is not a problem. It is an inferno. The fuselage would reach 500 degrees Celsius. Aluminum, it would melt. Steel, it would disintegrate. The answer was not on the shelf. They needed titanium, a rare mystical metal, strong as steel but much lighter, capable of withstanding infernal heat. But there were two problems. First, titanium was almost impossible to work with. It was so hard it broke steel tools. It was so brittle it shattered under stress. Kelly's team had to invent new tools, new machining techniques, just to be able to cut the metal. The second problem was bigger. The world's largest supplier of high-quality titanium was the Soviet Union, the enemy itself. The CIA had to intervene. They created front companies, fake bank accounts in tax havens, secret purchasing operations around the world. America secretly bought the metal from its own enemy to build the secret weapon that would spy on them. With the titanium in hand, paradox arose. The metal expands dramatically with heat, an expansion of centimeters across the entire plane. If Kelly Johnson built the plane perfectly sealed on the ground, the moment it hit Mach 3, it would tear itself apart. It would shatter in the sky. Kelly's solution was madness, an act of counterintuitive genius. He built the plane loose. On the ground, the SR-71 was a broken machine. Its panels didn't fit. There were visible gaps in the fuselage. Its cockpit was not pressurized, and the most shocking part, it leaked. The SR-71 didn't use normal fuel. It used a special fuel, JP7, designed not to explode in extreme heat. It had such a high ignition point that you could throw a lit match into it and the match would go out. The pilots described the scene. They would walk out to the aircraft and find it in a pool of its own fuel. The JP7 dripped from the joints from the panels onto the tarmac. The plane looked sick. It had to leak on the ground to survive in the sky. Takeoff was a controlled ballet. The pilot and the reconnaissance systems officer, RSO, wore full spacesuits, identical to those of the Apollo astronauts. They took off with the tank almost empty, just enough to get airborne. And only then, they would meet a special tanker plane, the KC-135Q, to fill the tank completely, already in the air. Imagine being the pilot. You are in a spacesuit, sitting in a plane that is leaking fuel on purpose, about to fly faster than a missile. Would you have the courage? Leave your opinion in the comments. When the Blackbird accelerated to Mach 3, the engineering miracle happened. The infernal heat of friction heated the titanium. The metal expanded. The fuselage sealed itself perfectly. The joints closed. The leak stopped. The plane only became whole when it was flying faster than a bullet. The engines were another impossibility. Designed by Pratt & Whitney, the J-58s, they were hybrids. Mechanical beasts. At low speeds, they worked like normal turbojets. But above Mach 2, a series of giant cones at the front of the engines began to move backward. They redirected the supersonic airflow and the engines transformed into ramjets. They stopped burning fuel and started burning the air itself. The plane, in effect, became a manned missile. It was a violent flight. Pilots feared something called an unstart. An engine failure at Mach 3, it was like hitting a brick wall. A violent explosion that threw the plane sideways, often disintegrating the aircraft. Flying the Blackbird was not for just anyone. And how did it navigate? GPS did not exist. Magnetic compasses were useless at that speed and altitude. The SR-71 used the stars. It had an astro-inertial navigation computer, an automated sextant that read the position of 61 different stars, even during the day. Celestial navigation, 25 kilometers high. For 30 years, the Blackbird was the ghost. It flew over Vietnam, over North Korea, over the Middle East, over the Soviet Union. The Soviets knew it was there. They saw the trace on their radars. They hated it. It was a daily humiliation. They fired over 4,000 missiles at it. 4,000 kill attempts, MiG, SAMs, everything they had. Not one, ever, got close. The pilot's standard response to being detected was not to evade, was not to dive, was not to use countermeasures. The pilot's standard response to hearing a missile alarm was simply to accelerate. He pushed the throttle forward. The missile flying at Mach 2 simply couldn't keep up. The Blackbird flew faster than the missile. It disappeared over the horizon. There is a famous legend. An SR-71 pilot was flying over California. He heard air traffic controllers on the radio talking to smaller planes like Cessnas. Controller, Cessna 123. What is your ground speed? Pilot, 120 knots. Controller, F-18, what is your ground speed? Pilot, 600 knots, sir. The Blackbird pilot, bored, decided to join the conversation. Controller, this is Blackbird, what is our ground speed? A long pause on the radio. The controller, his voice trembling, Blackbird, I'm tracking you at 1,982 knots. Over 3,600 kilometers per hour. The SR-71 pilot just replied, thank you, controller. We're showing a little faster than that. Total silence on the radio. The SR-71 was never shot down, never damaged by the enemy, never caught. It retired undefeated. The only opponent that beat it was the government budget. With the advent of spy satellites, the cost of maintaining this impossible fleet became too high. In 1998, the legend went to the museum. The Blackbird was not just a plane. It was a statement, a titanium monument to impossible engineering. Built in secret, with metal bought from the enemy, leaking fuel on the ground and melting from heat in the sky. It was the definitive answer to the question, what if? It proved that limits are just things we haven't broken yet. It is and always will be the most extraordinary flying machine ever built. For more engineering legends like this, subscribe and ring the bell. History is full of these ghosts, and we will find all of them. Check out this other video about the Soviet giant that tried and failed to copy it.